my friend Tony Graham, who's one of my patrons, because Tony wanted to talk through with me an idea that he had for a game, but he was struggling to get started on where to design it. And you can see that video right there. However, I've been wanting to get back to basics and do a series of videos very much taking beginners or people who are interested or new to the concept of miniatures wargame design through what I think are the core stages of design to achieve a satisfactory outcome, whatever that might look like to you. And one of the things that Tony's example really illustrated was that he had terrific foundational goals. Foundational goals are the must-have features that your game needs to have, and Tony started with a very, very clear brief on what those foundational goals were. He wanted a small size, he wanted a quick play time, and he wanted to be able to set up, play through and put away really quickly because he had limited time and limited space within which to work. And that really worked for me, and that was a really excellent starting place. But I thought it would be really worth going back to basics and talking about what foundational goals are, where they come from, and how you're going to use them to guide your game design project to a successful conclusion. Foundational goals are a great thing to have in life, quite apart from miniatures wargame design. Anything that you're going about in life where you're trying to achieve something that is currently beyond your reach, you need to start by clearly articulating what it is you want out of the process that you're going to put yourself through. Now, I learned this right back in my military days when we had something called the orders process, and the orders process started with the mission, the overall statement by the commander in the room of what we were trying to achieve and why we were trying to achieve it. And that mission statement really sort of sums up what foundational goals are about. But it's not enough just to articulate a mission statement when it comes to game design. You might know what you're wanting to do and why you're trying to do it, but if you are approaching game design as a personal project or as a team project, there need to be certain features of the game that you begin with. Before you even start to think about design, there must be a picture in your head of what features you expect that game to have, and you need to start articulating them right at the beginning, because without that you're going to head off down a rabbit hole and you're going to end up with a game that doesn't bear any resemblance to what you wanted it to look like at the start. And also you're going to make the process of getting there needlessly complicated. And we'll look at why that's the case in a moment. So first of all, your foundational goals can be anything, absolutely anything, any feature that to you is an important driving function of the game, something that it has to have to make you happy and feel like it's right, then make it a foundational goal. Now, we're talking about miniatures wargames today, so in that context it could be anything like scale. You've got a specific size of miniature that you want to use. It could be the size of the table. Does it want to be a 4 foot by 4 foot, 6 foot by 8 foot, or just a tiny 2 foot by 2 foot game? It could be play length. You want a game that's going to consume a whole weekend, or you want a game that's going to be done and dusted in a lunch hour? Maybe, and this is a classic, you've got specific miniatures that you want to write a game for. Now, this is extremely common with the major manufacturers in the industry. What they do is they sell miniatures. What makes the money is the sale of the miniatures, not the sale of the game. So when they're designing a game, they're going to design it to make sure that it drives the sales of the miniatures. And although it's always possible to use other miniatures, if your opponent agrees, the object of design is to make that as awkward as possible, to make it far easier to simply buy the miniatures that the game was designed for. And there's nothing wrong with that. If your job is to sell miniatures, for heaven's sake, make selling miniatures the foundational goal of the game. That's a completely logical and legitimate approach. So whatever you want it to be can be a foundational goal. But let's talk about why we have foundational goals. Because they're not just there as a starting place. They are there as your guiding light, your anchor, your rock. They're where you turn when you're confused. So at the very start of the process, they give you strong hints about where you need to go next to move your project forwards. Later on in the process, when you might think that you understand your foundational goals perfectly and you've really developed the game to a place that you quite like, it's easy to run into design quandaries and queries where you don't quite know where to turn. Should I include rules for this? Should I simplify that? Or should I make it more complicated? And the answer is always go back to your foundational goals, because if any question that you're asking yourself has an answer in the foundational goals, you go with those. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're writing a cowboy themed game and you want to decide whether you should include rules for fighting on top of a moving locomotive in your game, because fighting on a moving locomotive is very fundamental to that cinematic cowboy experience. Look back at your foundational goals. Did you build in the ability to fight on top of a moving locomotive as part of your foundational goals? If you did, great, write those rules. If you didn't though, and there's a good chance that you didn't, well, maybe those are rules that can be left out of the game for now. Get the game finished and come back to those other ideas later as an expansion or a special mission or whatever it might be. Put those aside, don't let them distract you, move on, focus on your foundational goals. Now, in this series talking about game design and the Game Design Tutor series, I want to make sure that what I'm telling you is something that you can see me turning back on my own work. So, as this is the first me to you video in the Game Design Tutor series, let me tell you, I am going to be writing a brand new game in the course of this series. So I'm going to start writing the game right here at the beginning of the series. I'm going to talk you through every stage of the development. Now, I need to say, I have not written this game. I am talking to you now at camera. I have not started, except just enough that I can talk to you about what we're doing in this episode. So I have written my foundational goals for the game, and I've got them down here on my notebook, and we're going to have a look through what they are. So to illustrate what I mean when I'm talking about these foundational aspects of your game design process and how you're going to use them to get started. So number one, I've got 5 foundational goals. Number 1, it's going to be fantasy or pseudo-historical. And what do I mean? That's a very broad foundational goal. You see, so it doesn't need to narrow itself down. I've left myself a lot of room to maneuver. So maybe it's going to be high fantasy or gothic fantasy. Maybe it's going to be pseudo-historical, Dark Ages, Arthurian. I mean, there's lots in that area. It could be Greek myth. It could be... Good example of a pseudo-historical game that's just coming out in the near future is The Silver Bayonet by Joseph McCulloch. You know, great idea of a pseudo-historical game. It's set during the Napoleonic Wars, but it's all about the forces of the supernatural fighting against human beings and vice versa. So that's a pseudo-historical setting game. I'm looking for something like that, but I haven't decided where it's going to go, but that's my foundational goal. So I'm not going steampunk, I'm not going sci-fi. Fantasy or pseudo-historical is my setting. Number 1. Number 2, I want it to be a skirmish game. Now, the idea of a skirmish miniatures game is something that varies depending on who you're talking to. By and large, a skirmish game means that one miniature represents one unit, one person or one robot or whatever it might be. On the tabletop, what you see is what you get, rather than in games where you've got regimental bases and one miniature might represent a platoon or more of actual soldiers on the tabletop. So that's the first thing that skirmish means. The second thing that skirmish usually means, and certainly means to me when I say it, is I can move one element on the tabletop without having to worry about the other elements. So if one model moves forward, I don't have to move the other models in its unit with it. It's moving independently. That's what I mean when I say skirmish. So it's going to be a skirmish-based game. Now, there's a lot of room within the world of skirmish games where you can decide whether something is or isn't skirmishy, but that's how I'm sort of boiling it down. Two main reasons why I'm going with skirmish game. The main one is it's very popular. The most popular genre of games by sales is skirmish games. By playtime, it may or may not be, but by sales, it is definitely skirmish games. The second reason is it keeps very manageable the number of miniatures that I'm going to need to play test the game. You know, I don't have an endless supply of resources. A skirmish game is much easier for me to get on the table and practice and demonstrate than a big regimental combat game. Number 3, it's going to have solo, co-op and PvP modes. Just like every other Precinct Omega game so far, you're going to be able to play it solo, you're going to play it co-op, and you're going to be able to play it against another human being. But all of those rules are going to be baked in. So it's not like you have a PvP game and you have to go and buy the rules for solo or vice versa. No, it's all going to be baked into the single set of rules, solo, co-op, PvP. That's just how I do things. Number 4, I've written compelling, exciting and tactical hand-to-hand experience. Now, this is related to that fantasy pseudo-historical setting. My previous games have been mostly sci-fi, which means that combats are decided very quickly, because if you shoot somebody, generally speaking, they're going down. But in hand-to-hand, it's a much more back and forward fluid experience. So a hand-to-hand combat should be more involved, more tactical and more interesting than a simple exchange of fire. And that's going to be critical to the experience of this game, not just to distinguish it from my other games, but also to distinguish it from other games on the market. That we want that experience of hand-to-hand combat to be absolutely core to the experience of the players on the tabletop. Compelling, exciting and tactical. Those are the 3 words I've used. And then finally, number 5, I want the random outcome generator to be either playing cards or 12-sided dice or both. If you've experienced Precinct Omega games before, you'll know that I do love a 12-sided dice. I've recently been exploring playing cards. They came into play in Zero Dark and they've come in again in Infinite Dark, and I believe that playing cards have got a lot of potential in them to explore, but I don't want to narrow it down because I've struggled to make playing cards work before in miniatures games, so I'm leaving myself the option of exploring playing cards but reverting to D12s if I can't make the cards work on their own or if I have to ditch them entirely. But it's part of the identity of Precinct Omega. D12s, playing cards. So that's my foundational goals, are just those 5 things. So having established my foundational goals then, the next question to ask is, so what? What do I do with these foundational goals? Well, in due course, hopefully several videos down in this series, you're going to see how I use those foundational goals to guide cases where I have difficult decisions to make. But right now, the only job of those foundational goals is to get me off the ground. So they're the launch pad from which I'm going to get started. And to look through them, you can see that each of those 5 could push me in a different direction to get started. So number 1, we've got the setting. You know, I could put a lot of time and effort into developing a really interesting, deep and compelling setting for the game. Now, I love writing settings, I love inventing new worlds for my games, and you know, I'm having enormous fun writing the storyline for the Horizon Wars games. But right now, I don't want to get into that. I want to make sure that the world and the game are in sync. And it's far easier to adapt a world to the game than it is to adapt a game to the world. So let's put the setting to one side for the time being and move on. So the next thing is that I want it to be a skirmish scale game, which means I'm going to need miniatures. I don't actually have a huge collection of fantasy or historical miniatures, and there are some fantastic manufacturers out there that I would love to explore. So I could definitely take time looking through the miniatures ranges that are already out there, seeing what miniatures inspire me, which ones look like things that I'd really like to get embedded into the game and make possible for players to enjoy. So that's number 2. I could do that, but that strikes me as another potential rabbit hole. At the end of the day, I don't sell miniatures, I write games. So miniatures are something somebody else does, something somebody else is going to be responsible for. Eventually, I'm going to want to make sure that my rules can be broadly applied to a wide range of miniatures, and I'd love to get miniatures to paint and photograph and include in the rulebook for this game in due course. But right now I think that's a distraction. So miniatures are a distraction, I'm going to put them to one side, we'll not look at that. Number 3, we got solo, co-op and PvP play. Now this is getting into the mechanics. How do you make the game work as a solo game and as a PvP game? Now I've already done that a couple of times with Zero Dark and Infinite Dark, but we're starting a brand new system now. That's an element of the mechanics that I can definitely engage with, but I think it needs to kind of, not put to one side, but it needs to be put to the back of my mind. I can start exploring other mechanics and then measure them against whether they're going to work in a solo and PvP environment. And if they do, then I can proceed. And if they don't, I can put them aside because I need to keep that in mind. But it's not something I can explore straight away. Compelling, exciting and tactical hand-to-hand combat. I've already said that's going to be the heart of the experience. That's what I want to be the thing that draws people to play this game. That looks like where I need to start. That I need to have an idea of how hand-to-hand combat is going to work in this new game, and then I can start looking at everything else. The last thing I had was cards or dice as a random outcome generator. Well, do you know what? That's all going to be wrapped up with how I do hand-to-hand. If I think about how I could do hand-to-hand, then I'm going to decide on whether it's cards or dice. But even though I'm going to proceed with hand-to-hand, the main kickoff for me is going to be that last one. Do I do cards or do I do dice? I'm going to need to play around with both of those options, see what I can come up with, and see if I can take ideas that fall out of that and push them back to my hand-to-hand idea. And if they work in hand-to-hand, then I can see, will they also work in solo? And if they work in hand-to-hand, and they work in solo, and they work in PvP, then we've got a starting place, and we can start digging down there. So that's how I'm going to use my foundational goals to move forward with my game. My game doesn't have a name yet. It is an unnamed game. We'll come back to that in a future episode and talk about coming up with ideas for your setting, branding, names, all that kind of stuff in an episode yet to come. So this first episode of this meter camera part of the Game Design Tutor series has come to an end, and it's been very short. Future episodes are going to be a little bit longer as we dig down into the weeds of mechanical development, as we look into setting expansion, as we look into marketing and publicity and all those things that go into making a new miniatures wargame work. I hope you found this first episode interesting and you will follow on. I make no promises how frequently I will be releasing new episodes of this series, simply because each stage takes a varying amount of time and I can't just sit in front of the camera and do everything to you. Otherwise, all you would see is me staring into space, scribbling notes and muttering to myself, and it doesn't make great video. So once I've got something worth sharing, I'll come back and we'll do some of it live, and I'll talk about some of what I'm actually thinking about live here on camera so that you can actually see me building a game as we go along. Thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you again next time. If you enjoyed this content, please consider supporting Precinct Omega via Patreon for behind the scenes, early access and exclusive extra videos and vlogs, or help keep the show on the road and get great new games from Precinct Omega at Wargame Front.